So I was doom scrolling through the gaming void on X the other day when I stumbled upon this little masterpiece from Kotaku. And let me tell you, I felt an overwhelming urge to throw down the gauntlet. But you know, if Kotaku thinks their audience is clamoring for a top-tier analysis of 10-year-old spicy scenes, who am I to argue? They probably won't mind if we tackle something a little bit more intellectually stimulating, like dissecting the narrative of Dragon Age Inquisition with some analysis techniques that might actually engage some brain cells. So buckle up, because we're diving into the deep end. Who knows, maybe Kotaku will take some notes. Alright, so let's kick things off with Structuralism, where we untangle the narrative threads like we're trying to separate out the cables behind our TV and figure out what each one is for. Dragon Age Inquisition isn't just your average save-the-world story. Nope. This game loves to flex its narrative muscles with a complex structure that's about as straightforward as a pretzel. You, the Inquisitor, get saddled with the delightful little task of saving the world from a massive tear in the fabric of reality. You know, the usual, an endless parade of horrors from beyond the veil. And who do we have to thank for this lovely mess? None other than Corypheus, an ex-Tevinter magister turned darkspawn with an ego the size of a mountain and a grudge to match. But oh, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Come to think of it, I probably shouldn't have dropped that mountain on him the first time we met. The game's structure is a narrative labyrinth with political subplots, character arcs, and side quests all doing their part to tie your brain in knots. These aren't just random errands to pad out the playtime, each one is a thread in a much larger, tangled web. The story isn't just about smacking down the big bad, it's about playing 4D chess with Thetis' political elite, forging alliances, and serving as a free therapist for your companion's emotional baggage. So the narrative structure here, it's not just a bunch of quests strung together. It's a carefully crafted spiderweb that mirrors the complexity of the world and the dysfunctional, lovable messes we call characters. I suppose that must be why Kotaku limited their analysis to more carnal interests. You can't be that ideological and actually want to engage with complex characters and dysfunctional societies on anything more than a superficial level. Alright, now that we've sorted out our TV cables, it's time to rip them open and get a look at how they work with some good old deconstruction. On the surface, Dragon Age Inquisition might look like your classic hero's journey. You know the drill. The Inquisitor goes from being a nobody to the savior of Thetis. But if you dig a little deeper, things get a lot more complicated. And by complicated, I mean delightfully messed up. The Inquisitor isn't just your run-of-the-mill hero. Oh no, they're a political figure, a religious symbol, and let's be honest, a pawn in a much larger game of who can screw over Thetis the hardest. The choices you make aren't just there to give you warm fuzzies about saving the day. Nope, they're there to force you to stare into the abyss of moral ambiguity and ask yourself, am I really the hero here, or just another power-hungry figurehead manipulating events to fit my own narrative? And let's not forget your companions, those lovable, dysfunctional allies who each bring their own baggage to the party. They're not just along for the ride, they've got their own agendas, secrets, and clever ways of challenging your so-called heroism. Dragon Age Inquisition isn't just about playing the hero, it's about ripping apart the very concept of heroism and making you question if you're any different from the villains you're trying to stop. Which, if I'm being honest, is probably why games journalists wouldn't be interested. Deconstructing heroism might make them realize their moral high ground is not, in fact, quite so elevated. Next up, we've got Intertextuality, a fancy way of saying that Dragon Age Inquisition borrows from and references just about everything under the sun. If BioWare's writing team had a refrigerator, it'd be covered in magnets shaped like classic high fantasy tropes and political drama cliches. From obvious nods to The Lord of the Rings, because what's high fantasy without a little Tolkien homage, to the more subtle influences of Game of Thrones, you know, betrayal, bloodshed, bad decisions, Inquisition is steeped in a rich intertextual soup. And that subtitle, it's loaded with real-world historical baggage that dredges up images of show trials, religious persecution, and rival fanatical ideologies. I wonder if anybody in 2024 can relate. But hold on, it's not just external texts that Inquisition loves to riff on. The game's constantly dropping references to its own lore, like an overeager professor quoting their previous work. We've got callbacks to the struggle between mages and Templars, deep dives into the Fade, and shoutouts to the Maker, all pulling from the rich tapestry of the Dragon Age universe. If you're a newcomer, get ready to drink from the fire hose of lore, or at least pretend you know what's going on. There's some great channels that cover lore from Dragon Age. Lore University, Guild Dirthalin, and sometimes Wolfhard FPS gets in on it too. I highly recommend checking them out, especially if you want to be ready for fall's next installment. It's this intricate layering of influences, both external and internal, that gives Inquisition its narrative depth, and honestly, that's something I'd love to see games journalists explore if they could stop rolling in cringeworthy articles for 5 seconds. Alright, let's dive into Characterization and Archetypes, the bread and butter of any good RPG. Dragon Age Inquisition is brimming with characters who, at first glance, seem to fit neatly into traditional roles. You've got your noble heroes, tragic mages, and roguish charmers. We're one foul-mouthed edgelord assassin away from a tabletop RPG cliché. Oh wait, never mind. But hold on a second. Once you start digging, you realize these characters are anything but cookie cutter. Take Dorian, for instance. Sure, he's your archetypal mage, complete with tragic backstory and impeccable fashion sense, but he's also a man on the run from his past, battling the crushing expectations of his family and society, and trying to make peace with his own identity. And of course, he does this all with a roguish charm that makes even the most jaded inquisitor crack a smile. Then there's Solus, who strolls in like the wise mentor archetype straight out of central casting. But before you can say Fade Rift, he starts dropping existential bombshells that make you question everything you thought you knew about him. My Rise and Fall of Finn Harel video is going to be a wild ride. Inquisition loves to twist these archetypes into characters that feel real, flawed, and utterly compelling, kind of like life, but with more dragons. So while you're busy untangling the web of politics and moral dilemmas, remember these characters are doing the same, except they've got a whole lot more emotional baggage to carry around. And let's be real, that's really what makes them so damn interesting. Alright, let's wade into thematic analysis, where we dig into the big ideas that make the Inquisition more than just a series of fetch quests. One of the game's most prominent themes is the burden of leadership. As the Inquisitor, you're not just herding a bunch of heroic misfits, you're at the helm of a grand movement, a cause, and occasionally an entire army. The game doesn't just whisper about the weight of your decisions, it shouts them from the rooftops. Every choice you make, every strategic decision you set into motion, comes with consequences that could make or break the entire world. It's a bit like trying to juggle flaming swords while riding a unicycle on a tightrope stretched over a pit of acid. Leadership isn't just a role, it's a responsibility. And Inquisition doesn't shy away from showing how that burden can wear you down and test your resolve, forcing you to make impossible choices that sacrifice the moral high ground. And let's not forget how this theme echoes across the game, casting a shadow over every decision and dialogue, from dealing with political machinations to grappling with personal sacrifices. Inquisition gives the burden of leadership a depth and complexity that's rarely matched. It's not just a theme, it's a full-scale war on your conception of whether you're qualified to even dream of being a leader. Once again, I think I can see why Kotaku would shy away from substantive takes. Confronting the content of a narrative like this would likely smash their dreams of being thought leaders in the glorious revolution to usher in utopia. Now let's dive into narrative perspective and focalization, where we figure out who's telling the story and how it's being told. In Inquisition, the main lens is through the eyes of the Inquisitor, but don't get too cozy sitting in Solus's rotunda. This game loves to shake things up with shifts in focalization through its companion quests and cutscenes. Each companion quest gives us a peek through another character's eyes, opening up new angles on the story, the world, and the colorful cast of characters. It's like getting VIP access to different perspectives that flesh out the narrative and make Thedas feel like a living, breathing place. And this technique isn't just for making the world richer, it's a nifty analytical tool too. Try envisioning what led up to any interaction between two non-Inquisitor characters, then check if there are journal or codex entries that might support your imagined backstory. It's like being a detective in a fantasy world, piecing together the untold tales that make the narrative even more intricate. Let's dive into Ludonarrative Analysis, where we dissect how the story and gameplay mechanics play nice, or don't. In Inquisition, the narrative and gameplay are often in sync, with the combat, dialogue choices, and exploration all contributing to this grand story. But oh, those moments of ludonarrative dissonance. These are the times when the story and the gameplay seem to be having an awkward argument. Take for instance the fact that you're leading the Inquisition, a religious crusade and emerging world power. Yet you also find yourself knee-deep in fetch quests and herb gathering, particularly in the hinterlands. It's a bit like being asked to save the world while also picking up groceries for the local shopkeeper's sick grandmother on the other side of town. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for the game. I love the game. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be making this video. I love it almost as much as I dislike Kotaku. It's a delicate dance to achieve the perfect balance, and while Inquisition generally gets it right, there are definitely some moments where the cracks start to show. The war table operations, Skyhold improvements, and judgment quests, for example, do a really decent job of integrating gameplay and narrative as far as making the narrative relevant to the mechanics that you're playing with. But if you're making a game about diplomacy, maybe make the diplomacy and political intrigue mechanics a little bit more engaging. I suppose I'm glad Kotaku stayed away from the mechanics of their subject matter. Next up, let's dive into Socio-Cultural Analysis. Inquisition isn't shy about throwing shade at social issues. From the epic feud between mages and Templars to the political soap opera of Orlais, it's got it all. It's like the game developers took a look at contemporary concerns and decided, hey, let's make this as dramatic as possible and throw in some dragons for good measure. The game's world is basically a gigantic fantasy mirror that reflects our own issues, just with more swords and fewer spreadsheets. Whether it's tackling the treatment of a marginalized group or poking at the nature of power and corruption, Inquisition is on a mission to make you think about power dynamics, authority, and personal liberty. And incidentally, all good fantasy is trying to make you think about social, cultural, and political issues. The fantasy that doesn't is usually what finds itself in the bin-marked derivative tripe. So there is literally not one bit of it that should surprise you when playing this game. However, it is important to understand that the game gives you a commentary of the world at the time it was created, 10 years ago. Now I've got to be honest, this type of analysis can sometimes be about as helpful as using a spoon to dig a hole, because it's being applied with a modern context to a time when that context was literally not possible. It is a flawed analytical tool in that regard. Because it's also bound to a modern context, it is also the least enduring analytical tool you can use to examine a narrative. Unfortunately, the social sciences have also been terrifyingly good at making it the most prolific analytical tool for decades, probably because it requires the least intellectual effort for the largest short-term financial payout. Maybe that's why I'm a little bit grumpy about games journalism. They're like that friend who you used to do everything with when you were in high school, but they took one social science class in undergrad and spent the next 20 years missing the bigger picture. So next time you read an article that's all about social commentary but feels like it's just skimming the surface, remember it might be time to ask for a deeper dive. Or just maybe ask them to stick to the dragons. Alright, moving on to psychological and psychoanalytical analysis, where we dive into the minds of our characters like we're sneaking through their bedroom while they're out, only slightly less creepy. Dragon Age Inquisition is practically a goldmine for this kind of analysis, brimming with characters who are wrestling with their own personal demons, sometimes literally. Think of it as a reality show where everyone's therapy sessions are broadcast live and you're the therapist. On second thought, that sounds like hell, don't do that. I know what you're thinking. We should start at Solus. The obvious god complex is, well, obvious. But I'm a bit of an odd duck, so here's a twist for you. Let's talk about the Iron Bull first. This guy's like a walking advertisement for Jungian psychoanalysis. He's a Kunari warrior who's also sort of pretending to be a Talvashoth mercenary, embodying an internal duality in a way that would make Jung himself raise an eyebrow. It's like he's got two internal battlefields going on, one with the Kun and the other with his desire for freedom that only grows larger as he spends more time as a mercenary. This internal tug of war is a perfect metaphor for anyone trying to juggle their day job with the secret wish of becoming a professional YouTuber. Now that we've addressed Iron Bull, we can address everyone's favorite former pretend deity, Solus. On the outside, he's your go-to elven sage, commonly handing out advice like it's Halloween candy. But dig a little deeper and you find he's got a major chip on his shoulder about every religion under the sun, and even atheism too. But if you dig even deeper still, and shell out the money for the DLC, you eventually find out that he's actually Finn Harel, the Dreadwolf, basically the Elven's most wanted. Behind his serene facade lies a whirlwind of guilt, anger, and a god complex that would make Freud's pen run dry. But here's the kicker. Solus also struggles with imposter syndrome. Despite his grand plans to reset the world and save Thetis from itself, he's constantly haunted by the fear that he's not the true hero, just a misguided fool with a messiah complex. It's like trying to hit the cosmic reset button and having the ability to at least reach it while secretly fearing you're not qualified to handle the office printer. And don't think the Inquisitor is off the hook here. Depending on your choices, your Inquisitor might be dealing with leadership burnout, survivor's guilt, or even imposter syndrome themselves. Are they the chosen one, or just a puppet in a grander scheme? The game leaves room for interpretation, allowing players to project their own doubts and insecurities onto the character. Kind of like a Rorschach test with a side of dragon slaying. I'd love to delve into the psychological significance of the Fade, but this video's already running longer than it should be, so I'm not going to go into a full-on psychoanalysis marathon. If you're itching for more content like that, drop a comment below, and I might just whip up a separate video dedicated to the psychological significance of the Fade. And now we arrive at Mythological Analysis, a fancy term for digging into how Inquisition plays with the same old myths and archetypes that have been around since the dawn of storytelling. It's like discovering your favorite fantasy game is actually a mashup of ancient legends and bedtime stories your grandma used to tell. Spoiler alert, it's way cooler than that. If the shelf life of socio-cultural analysis is measured in months, the shelf life for this method is measured in epochs. First up, the Inquisitor. They're basically the chosen one archetype on steroids. You start out as an average Joe or Jane, and next thing you know, you're handed the keys to save the world. Think of them as a spiritual successor to King Arthur or Moses, minus the whole parting the Red Sea thing. This archetype is like the ultimate wish fulfillment fantasy. Hey, maybe if I'm really lucky, I'll get to be special too. If Andraste is an analog for Jesus and Divine Justinia is the Pope, then the Inquisitor really is like Michael the Archangel or something. Enter Corypheus, our very own Dark Lord. If you've ever wanted to see a villain who's basically a love letter to every evil overlord from mythology, look no further. He's got all the makings of a classic antagonist. Ancient, malevolent, and with a power-hungry streak that would make even Saruman blush. I'd say he's analogous to Sauron or Lucifer, but I have a feeling Veilguard is going to cast him into a false prophet role, with Gillinan as the Whore of Babylon and Elgar'nan as the Beast. His quest for godhood is less of a power grab and more of a cosmic reboot, kind of like the ancient battle between good and evil, but with more dragon-sized drama. The Fade, on the other hand, is like a modern spin on the underworld or spirit realm. It's the place where the veil between the mundane and the divine gets as thin as a piece of paper, and your characters get to confront their deepest, darkest fears, kind of like a psychological horror movie with bonus points for magic. The Fade is where heroes go to wrestle with their inner demons, and maybe even take a stroll through their worst nightmares. It's the hero's descent into the unknown, where facing the darkness within becomes less metaphorical and more literal. And since I've already brought up the Evanuris, their story is a classic tale of divine drama, betrayal, and downfall, a mythological soap opera that rivals anything you'd find on daytime television. Solus, as Finn Harel, is your trickster god, bringing chaos and wisdom in equal measure. It's like having Loki crash your fantasy dinner party, forcing everyone to question their life choices and rethink the status quo. In his case, literally separating dreams from reality. This mythological richness makes Inquisition more than just another fantasy romp. It taps into the very roots of human storytelling, and if you're anything like me, you'll be eagerly awaiting to see how the trickster archetype plays out in Dragon Age the Veilguard. Though, I must say, I still wish they'd kept the title Dreadwolf, because who doesn't love a little divine dramatic flair? And there you have it, a deep dive into the narrative of Dragon Age Inquisition using every analytical tool in the shed. We've unraveled the story's layers, poked at its archetypes, and even taken a few jabs at the critics who seem to think spicy scenes are the pinnacle of gaming journalism. They're not. If you enjoyed this journey through Thetis and its myriad narrative quirks, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button like you're Leliana going after a rogue agent. And if you're new here, welcome. Make sure to check out this video for a peek into my design philosophy, because why stop at analyzing games when you can also hear me dive into how I make them? As always, I'd like to thank you all for sticking around, and I invite your harshest of criticisms in the comments below. Your feedback is always welcome, so tell me what you liked, or what you didn't like, or what you'd like to see more of. Until next time, keep crafting stories that are more epic than a listicle of tawdry sex scenes. And remember, in the world of gaming, there's always more to uncover, so don't stop exploring.